Good evening and welcome to another voter education forum presented by the Hillsborough County Democratic Committee. Tonight's program will deal with a brief history of the Free State Project, why New Hampshire was chosen for this experiment in government, its negative impact on the state, and most importantly, what we as voters can do about it. Tonight's program is being recorded. Anybody who wishes to view it can see it on YouTube shortly after the program. You will notice that there is no chat at the bottom of the screen like there is in a normal Zoom meeting, and there's a reason for that. One is that we find it distracting for the speakers and for the audience, and also we are aware that there are a number of Free State people on tonight, and we don't need the detracting comments. So instead, it's being replaced by a Q&A button. So I would ask that you be patient. A lot of people have questions that are automatically answered later on by the speaker's presentation. So I would say, ask you to hold your questions towards the end of the program. And if there's still something that hasn't been covered, then by all means, feel free to enter it into the chat and it will be submitted to the panelists. My name is Roger Lassard. I'm the chairman of the Hillsborough County Democratic Committee. And it's my distinct honor to introduce our host tonight, who is Kermit Williams, who's a former member of the House, spent several years in the House from the town of Wilton, and is currently on the Hillsborough County Democratic Executive Committee and has been for a number of years. And with without any further ado, I'll be back at the end of the program to make a couple of more announcements, but right now I'll hand things over to Kermit. Kermit, take it away.
Thanks, Roger. And it's my distinct honor and privilege to introduce Caitlin Rollo. Caitlin lives in Hopkinton, and she's a community activist and union organizer. Her roots as a community organizer began by being a student activist upset about the conditions of her local public schools in Manchester. Caitlin was also the only girl in the state, at least in one year, when she played Babe Ruth baseball with the boys in Goffstown. And she was also the youngest female elected official in the country while serving in the New Hampshire House of Representatives while she was in college at UNH. She's currently on the board of the Merrimack County Democratic Committee, Open Democracy for Action, and 603 Forward. And on a personal note, I've had the opportunity both in the legislature and elsewhere to observe Caitlin and her husband, Mike, in all of their advocacy on a variety of topics. And I can say that we are extraordinarily lucky to have them both in New Hampshire and both in the Democratic Party. Thanks, Caitlin.
Thanks so much. And it's nice to see you again and to be back with the Hillsborough County Dems, which I was actually a member of. Said this before to some folks. I was a member of the Hillsborough County Democratic Committee back when Manchester was actually part, and we were all one big group. But anyways, it's glad to be back. And so tonight, for our agenda, real quickly, we're going to kind of start us off with where are we now, what's happening, what does the current landscape look like here in New Hampshire, what does it look like nationally, then kind of dig into what is this libertarian Republican vision for our state, what organizations are moving this agenda here in New Hampshire, and then we'll dig in a little bit with this Free State Project and sort of what are their goals, who are they, what are they about, and then kind of flip it and say, hey, how do we stop this attack on our democracy? What does it look like? What can we do to take action and bring us back to our communities, bring us back to our roots, and then get into some Q&A. So real quickly, what we're seeing nationally, not just here in New Hampshire, is I just want to bring us back to the start of the year, right after President Biden took office. And Mitch McConnell laid out his plans for this is how we're going to win back in 2022. This is what we're going to do. And what it was they're going to sow chaos and confusion at our local school district level with all of what was happening with COVID. You know, are schools going back? What does schools going back look like? Are there masks? Are there not masks? And sort of that is something that we've seen play out across the country in school districts and school boards, you know, just this toxic level. And a lot of it was manufactured for a specific cause and for a specific reason. And it was for the 2022 elections and beyond. And so the way that we're seeing it play out here in New Hampshire is we have our friends with the Americans for Prosperity holding training saying, hey, this is how you can have public testimony at your local school board meeting. We have events where our other friends there with Freedom Works, which is another national group here that has some libertarian ties, saying, hey, parents, come learn more, come get your rights back. And then we have our esteemed education commissioner who also is beating this drum with some intent as to really kind of reshape what public education looks like in this country. What does it mean to have public education? But on top of it, with eyes for 2022. So all of it has a lot of political, personal reasons to this work that they're doing.
Yeah, so they want each state to move New Hampshire closer to that libertarian paradise that they dreamed of in the beginnings of the Free State Project. And they imagine, you know, that New Hampshire would be a state that stands apart from all the other states around us in support of their values and their goals. And that, of course, ignores the fact that New Hampshire has much more in common with Massachusetts and Maine and Vermont. We have shared jobs, we have shared resources, and for many of us, we have a shared heritage. But instead, the current libertarian response to critics is, well, if you don't like it, leave. They'd like a state where more libertarian Republicans move in and we all go somewhere else. So we just need to make sure we don't do that.
For sure, for sure. And so part of, you know, knowing and understand this and not giving in is sort of understanding what is this libertarian Republican vision for New Hampshire. And at the root of it, not just here in New Hampshire, but nationally, is privatization and the limits on collective power. Now, when people see collective power, they're going to instantly think labor unions, but it's not just labor unions. It's breaking down those institutions within our communities. It's school boards. It's breaking those down. What are those groups? It's breaking down PTAs. Like, it's really making it a very, very individualized society, sort of a gig economy, but really within each of our communities. And so really long term, that is really what they're working towards, along with some of those other pieces of how do you get there and what does it look like when you're thinking through dismantling certain pieces of our democracy. And interwoven in all of this is also voting rights and what does that look like and the access to the ballot. So here in New Hampshire, the way we've seen it play out for some of their real big goals for these libertarian Republicans, more specifically over the past decade or so, and Kermit can attest to this and what he's seen in the legislature, is a real intent on abolishing taxes and regulations, defunding and privatizing public education incrementally over time. First, it started with homeschooling. Then it moved into some like, let's study this issue. Then it moved into like, let's get this bill in. And so over time, they're just incrementally moving that needle to reshape what it looks like in our communities for children to have access to an education. Putting limits on the access to the ballot box. This is something that they really beat the drums around. Voter fraud, that never truly really pans out. And really what it's about is really making it so that less folks are interested in voting and making it harder for folks to vote. And what does that look like? These voter ID laws, all of that is interwoven into this libertarian Republican agenda, not just here in New Hampshire, but nationally. And then of course, like I said before, it's abolishing labor unions. We had on the national stage the Janus decision. which got rid of agency fee shops for labor unions. But it's also, like I said before, more recently over the past couple of weeks, we've seen some real push from these libertarian Republican groups, not just here in New Hampshire, but across the country, to have state school board associations disaffiliate with their national. So it's really, once again, getting back to, and where I talked before, limits on collective power. It's breaking down those pieces of where we have community and where we've created, we've created community within our own towns, within our own cities.
So I wanted to drill into taxes a little bit, because I think people should understand that taxes are a zero-sum game. As it is right now, we squeeze our school budgets. We're underfunded in almost every state service, and we spend way too little on things like transportation. New Hampshire's transportation, roads, bridges, public transport, is ranked 41st out of the 50 states. And that's in a country where the whole country is ranked by the Society of Civil Engineers as a C- in terms of the quality of our transportation network. So we're already failing to fund the things that we need to make this place a decent place to live. More cuts will mean more things falling apart. And it's like a game of whack-a-mole. If you cut state taxes, that'll make your property taxes go up. The fat in the state budget was cut out a long time ago, if there ever was any. And so when you cut taxes, you got to find the money somewhere, and the money is in your house and the house across the street. And so you'll see your property taxes go up and up and up if Republicans are allowed to cut the state budget or cut taxes.
Right. And that's, part of getting at sowing that chaos and like really stirring into that toxic culture that's being sowed at the national level and bringing it down into our communities. And it's just really not appealing. And it really turns a lot of folks off. But part of that is also a tactic too, in suppressing folks from wanting to be engaged in whatever's happening in town. Because quite honestly, who wants to go to a school board meeting these days after what everyone reads? It's like, heck no. But you know what? Folks need to go, and folks need to be engaged, because democracy is what we're about. And that's what we've always been about. Right. So real quick, where are we seeing this happen when we're talking about politics? And what does it look like? So at the federal level, we have what's happening in Congress, some of stall tactics and things like that. On the state level, what we really see is what really, some of these tactics that they've used specifically, say, with our budget, of attaching extreme policy that would not have passed on its own through the traditional House and Senate process, being attached to our state budget. So a way to move a political agenda through a non-traditional means that we've never seen policy like that attached to our state budget, like what was attached this year. And then really, once again, really honing in on this big piece is what's happening locally in our communities, and how what we're seeing is coming. It's a lot of it is being manufactured with intent on getting folks ginned up in their towns and communities around something that then can correlate to turning folks out for federal races. So a lot of it is moving up and down that political spectrum. So CRT has little to nothing to do, actually quite nothing to do with what's happening in schools and in K-12 schools in New Hampshire, yet somehow folks are gonna try to talk about that in a US Senate race or US congressional race, when that's literally graduate level courses that are happening.
At the state level, what we've seen is that libertarians, and for that matter, other conservatives, have been able to get into, especially the state house, because there are 400 seats in that house, and it pays $100 a year. So it's basically a purely volunteer job. And in a lot of parts of New Hampshire, there just aren't that many people that really want to do it. And so someone steps forward and people almost don't even question really what their intent is, what their real goal is. That's why we've ended up with a bunch of people from the Free State Project and other libertarians in the state legislature, even if their goals aren't necessarily the goals of the average person in New Hampshire. And you see the same kind of thing, again, because we're talking about mostly volunteers in local government, select boards and planning boards and zoning boards, because people don't want to do it. People are busy. People have other things that are on their mind, and it can be a lot of hours without any compensation. And so people who have goals, if you wanted to eliminate all the zoning protections that would keep, somebody from ruining your neighborhood, you could just run for zoning board, and then once you get in there, you convince people that, well, this is better for business if you cut all these zoning laws. Those aren't things that most people would support, but the problem is most people aren't paying attention.
Right. And so want to dig in next in talking about some of the ways that these libertarian Republicans are moving their agenda. And so one of the big things, and I got this from someone that used to be part of the libertarian Republican world, someone that really worked for pushing vouchers in several states until he saw, oh my goodness, this isn't what I thought it would be, and it's really about something else. And so what he talked about was sort of how compromise is used by folks, by libertarian Republicans, to move the needle for their next initiative. And that in the end, it's never really a compromise, because like I said, with some of what we've seen with some of these attacks on just public ed, started as homeschooling, and then it goes to what would vouchers look like? Well, let's study that. But it's always incrementally moving the needle further and further down the roads to what the true intent is, which is purely privatization and having a gig economy for our public schools, and what that looks like. And so, and that's just one example. You can pick any other issue and break it down that way. So compromise is, they use it tactically and strategically to get to where they want to be for their end game. And part of the process too is pitting folks against each other. What are we seeing now? Once again, back to our school boards, what are we seeing? There are these entities out there stirring and agitating, pitting people for reasons that just on instinct, they're not even sure, but they need to go and they need to yell and they need to scream and they need their 5 minutes of fame. But also part of it too is the folks doing this have really, really deep pockets. They're well funded. They're coming from national sources for national reasons to move a national agenda here in our state, here in our own communities. It's always important to know they're always coming back for more. For example, we have folks here in my town, follow them on the local town Facebook page. We all have those, right? It's just every year it's something with a core group of folks of what they're against and why the town is horrible, and why, we can't be voting for this budget or that budget. They're just always coming back. And what I've seen more recently, specifically, especially during COVID times, or especially during some of like this real heightened work of really getting folks ginned up for the 2022 election, is they've created a like a statewide network of Facebook, easy to pull Facebook posts that are really divisive and really are meant to like get folks aggravated and agitated, that then they're sharing out into our community Facebook pages. And it's really quite toxic. And, I find it very unappealing. And I'm a political beast. I get it. I understand politics, but it's just very, very, very toxic.
Yeah, so like a lot of conservative movements, the Republican Libertarians reduce much of their campaign to tag words and slogans because they really struggle to coherently state why you should support their goals. And so slogans are easier to remember and easier to kind of paste on a bumper sticker. You know, so for instance, they'll describe Democrats of any stripe as socialists. And, you know, if you've studied politics like Caitlin and I, you know that socialism means that the government owns the means of production. And that's mainly what socialism means. We don't have socialism in the United States anywhere. We have goals that involve sharing. You know, I always find it funny because the Republicans point to the Constitution and talk about why, you know, the New Hampshire Constitution and why, you know, it protects their Second Amendment rights and so forth. But to me, the most important part of the New Hampshire Constitution is Part 1, Article 3. And what that says is that when men enter into a state of society, they surrender up some of their natural rights to that society in order to ensure that the protection of others, without such an equivalent, the surrender is void. I mean, it isn't all about freedom, even though that's what the Libertarians would tell you.
Right. I mean, let's think about it, Kermit, right? We have in most of our towns and communities, we have what? The selectman and the what? Overseer of the poor, right?
Yeah.
It's the selectman and the overseer of the poor in a lot of our communities, those positions. Those are their titles because the fact of the matter is our last safety net that we have here in our state is in our own home communities. And when someone can't pay their rents, or when someone can't pay their heat bill, or if someone can't pay their water bill, where are they going? And if anyone served on town government, they know where they're going and they know why.
Yeah, one of the favorite phrases used in the legislature last year was taxation is theft, you know, which is really, it was an anarchist slogan, you know, and I don't think any of us, you know, would support anarchy. In fact, I doubt even the Republicans support anarchy. In fact, they, you know, they kind of say the anarchists are the ones that were against them, you know, at rallies. But, you know, I'm struck by the connections between the Tea Party, which seems to have kind of faded away, and Libertarians in New Hampshire. And I don't know if they still use it, but the most famous saying by Grover Norquist, who was, you know, a Tea Party advocate, was, "I don't want to abolish government. I simply want to reduce it to the size where I can drag it into the bathroom and drown it in the bathtub." And that's really what Libertarians want. But you can look around the world and you can see the chaos that comes from failed government. And on the other hand, one of my favorite quotes, and I'll wrap up with this, is from Christopher Hitchens. And he said, "I always found it quaint and rather touching that there is a movement, the Libertarians in the US, that thinks Americans are not yet selfish enough."
Right, right. So to think about that, some of the organizations that we have here moving the Libertarian Republican agenda, we have this group of folks, a very small group of folks that have moved here, and we'll dig into them slightly in a little bit, called the Free State Project. We have the New Hampshire Liberty Alliance, which was an entity that was created by this small group of folks once they chose New Hampshire as their state that they would be creating a Libertopia in. And they operate purely at the state level, focusing on the state house. You have the House Republican Alliance. These are folks that operate as well at the state house. You have the Josiah Bartlett Center, which is a think tank, a libertarian Republican think tank. You have Americans for Prosperity. That's the sort of the group that does the phone banking, the door knocking, sending out millions of dollars of mail in our local and state elections. They're funded from national donors. You have the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is a conglomerate of corporations and other special interests that come together to draft model bills that then they hand to legislators and lawmakers to help advance their own personal causes at the state level. You have our two different kinds of taxpayer groups that you can see play out in your towns. You know, they kind of intertwine some, you know, I lose track of which one's which because I think they have a fight over what name is what. You have the Grand State taxpayers and you have the Coalition of New Hampshire taxpayers. We have this new group called Make Liberty Win, dumped over $1 million into state rep and state Senate races this past time around, created by one of these folks that moved here as part of this Free State Project. And then you have Rebuild New Hampshire, which is another one of those, or Reopen New Hampshire, or whatever their name is, that are moving some of these works. So these are some of the names that folks may be familiar with or that they've seen or have heard about over time.
And a lot of these have a specific influence in the New Hampshire legislature. The Liberty Alliance and some of the other groups, for instance, will do a scorecard of all elected officials. And, you know, it's pretty black and white that, you know, if you're a Republican and you vote on the 20 or 30 bills that they think are most important, you get an A. And if you are a Democrat and you don't vote for them, you get an F for. In some cases, they call you a constitutional threat. And, you know, it isn't really, it's so ham-handed that it really doesn't give a reasonable voter of any stripe, you know, conservative or liberal or in between, much information on how to make a choice. It's really just, well, either you voted for the things we like or you're a constitutional threat. And organizations like ALEC, which, you know, is a national organization, they are very popular among the Republicans because they write bills. And, you know, all of our legislators get $100 a year. We have no staff, you know, nobody's going to write bills for us. And so if you're not capable of putting together something that is a reasonable proposal to change the New Hampshire law, well, you just go to a group like ALEC and they'll say, well, this passed in Texas, so you might want to do it here in New Hampshire, as we're seeing in some of the proposals that are coming forward. But, you know, a lot of these groups, as Caitlin said, you know, there's outside funding and there's outside influence. And it's really an effort to make New Hampshire kind of look like something a lot different than every other state in New England, and a lot different than I think most of us thought this place was when we came to live here.
Right. And they've created what would be sort of what we call an echo chamber for all of these different ideas and values. And I know my hand's a little fuzzy, but it's, I talk with my hands. I say this when I talk to groups. So Zoom is a little awkward. So, but they've created a way where, so you have that bill that was not really your idea, though a lot of times they pitch as, I had this really great idea. That happens to look exactly the same as the bill being introduced in Florida, being introduced in Iowa, being introduced in Texas. That then you have the House Republican Alliance will say, this is a good bill. Josiah Bartlett will do some research on it and get it out there in the news to say, oh, what a great bill this is. And then you have these other groups that will, you know, when they go knocking on doors or sending out their mailers, they'll say, didn't you hear? Kermit was a constitutional threat for this bill that ALEC drafted, and Make Liberty Win is sending a mailer out for. So this is how, you know, just as a visual for everyone to understand of how a bill makes it through the sausage process in this Libertarian Republican infrastructure that's been created here in our state.
And all you have to do is just Google a sentence out of some of these bills, and it'll pop up in Texas or Mississippi or somewhere where ALEC holds sway. And, you know, in New Hampshire, they don't even bother to try to change a few of the words to make it sound unique.
No, the best is when there's typos and the bill drafters try to fix it, and then the legislator's like, why'd you do that? Anyways, moving along. So now what we want to do is to pause for a moment and travel back in time to an audio clip from 2001. And let me share my sound here.
Thank you, Jason. We'd like to remind our radio audience that our guest speaker tonight is Mr. Jason Sorens, founder and president of the Free State Project. This program is brought to you by the Patriots of the Republic Room on Pal Talk Internet in conjunction with Mel Pi's Crusade Radio, the most informative radio on the Internet. And the next question comes from Carol Ann. Carol Ann, take the mic.
Thank you, Jinx. I'd like to remind everyone that today, September 17th, is the 215th anniversary of the signing of the Constitution, and how appropriate that we'd be talking about real freedom this day. Jason, I would like to ask this question. Your eventual goal is to cut the size of government by 2/3. Will your 20,000 person force still be able to outvote the displaced government workers and those who will be deprived of government services in that state?
I think so. We've done a lot of research on exactly what 20,000 activists could accomplish, and what we found is that 20,000 activists could generate majorities in states up to about 1.2 million in population, and this is based on campaign finance expenditures, electoral results from other countries, and so on. Just to give one example of how this was calculated, the Libertarian Party in the year 2000 had a budget of 5.2 million and about 40,000 members. So we ourselves, with 20,000 members, should be able to raise about half that amount each year. So we've looked at states where Democrats and Republicans have spent less than about 5 million every election cycle. And those are states where we, just us 20,000, where we can outspend the entire opposition. And as you know, spending correlates very well with electoral success. So if we can actually outspend both the Democrats and Republicans combined, then we'll be in a great position for success. Now I should note, I say outspend both Democrats and Republicans, but it may end up that we do work within the Republican Party and sort of infiltrate it from the inside and bring it over to our own perspective. That's one option we're considering right now. It really depends on the state we choose. Now, as for the displaced government workers, once we start making our reforms, we have to be ready to encounter some kind of opposition. But we also have to remember that these people will eventually have to be leaving our state. If they can't get jobs, then the freeloaders, so to speak, are going to have to go somewhere else. And that will improve our electoral position because the people left will be the productive people, the taxpayers, people who have jobs, are making money, who own property. So I think the idea of displacing government workers actually helped us.
All right, so that was an audio clip of Jason Sorens, who is the person that came up with this idea of the Free State Project as part of his college work. And what the idea was to move 20,000 libertarians to achieve liberty in your lifetime. And one of their main focuses in doing this would be doing it via the electoral process at the state level. Now, as part of this, I'll dig in a second of how New Hampshire was picked. What did this look like? Actually, I'll dig in now real quick. Do you want to add anything, Kermit? Thoughts of that audio clip or anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the audio clip basically says New Hampshire, you know, the typical New Hampshire voter is lazy. That, you know, there is more than 1 million registered voters in New Hampshire. And Jason Sorens is saying that 20,000 people can come in here and essentially, you know, do more than the million people who already live here. Now, the reality is they haven't come close to getting 20,000 people. But I think the only way that they succeed at all is because we let them succeed.
Exactly. Exactly. So what is this Free State Project? Some folks may have heard of it, maybe why they popped on to the call today to find out more. So this was, like I said, an idea that came out of a college student's thesis, I believe, to move 20,000 people to a state to achieve liberty in their lifetime, create a libertarian utopia. And so after it was posted online in 2001, it started to gain some steam. And a lot of the folks on the national stage within the libertarian Republican infrastructure really found it fascinating and really sort of liked the idea. And so as it started to get some steam, a lot of like some real ideologues bought into the idea, and they went through a meticulous process of trying to choose a state. And they ended up landing on New Hampshire for several different reasons. One of the main reasons was, well, we border Canada. Another one is we have a port, and another one is our governor at the time, Craig Benson, remember, the only one-term governor that we've had in decades, opened them up, welcomed them with open arms and said, come on in, you know, let's achieve this libertarian oasis. So as part of that, they started to create some infrastructures of saying, okay, how do we actually do this? What does this look like? And part of it was signing a pledge to say that you would move to a state with the intent to achieve liberty in your lifetime. And part of the reason why they went through that process of having people sign a pledge to commit to uprooting their entire lives to move to a state for their political ideology was because they knew that they would get the people that were the extremes. Like they were the extreme, they held this extreme ideology that if I literally sign this pledge, we pick a state, I'm going to uproot my life and move it to that state. And then once I get to that state, I'm going to work really, really hard to get it to look what I want it to look like. And so if you go through some of the history of some of the old files that they have, you can see how they made the national network. 2003, they picked New Hampshire. After 2003, once they selected New Hampshire, they created that group that I touched on slightly in the previous slide, the New Hampshire Liberty Alliance, which is a group that was created by them to really focus on their libertarian goals that would be happening at the State House. And then as they started to have some of these folks that were some of the early pledge signers that were part of the 5,000 that helped to pick a state, once those folks uprooted their entire lives for this political ideology and moved to our state, they started to get out, hit the ground running. They started to work within the Republican networks that were in state. They realized real quick that, yeah, we kind of had a third party. Yeah, there was kind of a libertarian party, but the way to go was really to work within the New Hampshire Republican Party. So a lot in the early or mid 2000s, some of those tax cap initiatives that we saw pop up in our cities across the state, those were a lot of efforts that were led by these early Free Stater movers that kind of teamed up with Republicans, and they were sort of the folks that would knock on the doors to do the work. They'd make the phone calls, they'd get out there, and they really worked for their cause. But as they were doing that, they were, you go out, you knock on doors, you're making phone calls, you start to gain influence within a circle. And Republicans really liked that they had these folks that were willing to knock doors for them or willing to make phone calls. And then right around, I would say probably 2010, with that election and other things, they really started to ramp up this libertarian echo chamber with, as Kermit kind of mentioned, I think earlier, with the Tea Party movement. So there started to be a real cross-pollination in state between not just these early Free State Project movers, and, you know, there's a few that have trickled in afterwards. But you also had the Tea Party that popped up. You had the Glenn Beck 912 group in 2010 that popped up, and all these other little conservative groups that kind of banded together and did some cross-pollination. Now, another thing about the Free Staters and the Free State Project is, while they're working on uprooting their lives and moving to our state and working locally and in political offices, or to help elect folks, or to move their agenda for whatever their issues are, whether, I don't know, one of the early Free State movers does a lot with marijuana policy and things like that. On the same token, prior to them even selecting a state, they really knew that if this was going to work, and this is something that we really wanted to do and really wanted to achieve, we need to create a structure to help our pledge signers uproot their entire lives and move someplace. And so what they have is, and they started creating it before they even selected New Hampshire, is they have a way and a process for folks to say, hey, you know, yay, New Hampshire was selected. Yay, I want to move to New Hampshire. So from the moment someone says, hey, I want to move, they can go on a job board and find jobs. They can say, all right, I found a job, I'm ready to move. And they can go on another board and find a place where they can rent a house that's owned by a Free Stater, or they can buy a house from the realtor that's a Free Stater, or, you know, whatever it looks like, or you can sort of rent a room until you decide what you want to do when you get here. And so, you know, Kermit decides, hey, I'm going to uproot my entire life and I'm going to move to New Hampshire to achieve liberty in my lifetime. So Kermit signed the pledge. He signals, hey, I'm moving. He posts on Facebook, hey, just want to let everyone know I found my job through the postings. I'm moving this weekend. Thank you, Mark Warren, for helping me find a house. And then he says, I'm moving this weekend. The Free Staters, woo, all right, welcome wagon's going to pull on up and we're going to help move you in. And then once you're moved in, as you're moving in, they're going to say, all right, don't you forget, we have a meetup. So come to our meetup. And so this is a way that they've really created a really small community of these folks that have moved here with their ideology. But they've created a community in this mindset of establishing liberty in our lifetime. Do you have anything to add, Kermit?
Yeah, so
yeah.
The original rationale that Jason Sorens had for doing this was that libertarians basically were not very successful. There were, you know, no, at least at the congressional level or beyond, really anybody who ever got elected with the Libertarian after their name. I mean, Ron Paul, you might make an argument, was kind of a Libertarian, but he ran as a Republican. And really, there just weren't that many people that ascribed to their view of the world. But there were a few here and there. And so Jason's concept was, if we can get all the libertarians in one place, then we can be successful. And I think they picked New Hampshire. You know, we talked a little bit about how our legislature is unique, you know, both underpaid and way too big, maybe. But that made it possible for some committed volunteers to basically come in and make inroads. And the other thing that they did was they looked for opportunities, again, even within little towns, to coalesce, you know. So you coalesce as many libertarians into New Hampshire as possible, and then within New Hampshire, you pick places to coalesce there. And so I don't want to tell the whole story because I want you to read the book. There's a book called A Libertarian Walks into a Bear, which is a wonderful book about the Free State Project and what, you know, a subset of it that they called the Free Town Project. And it kind of, I think, speaks against the sort of the view that libertarians or Free Staters can come here and all get great jobs. And, you know, Jason's concept that after the government workers lose their jobs, they're, you know, they're freeloaders and they'll all move somewhere else. If you read A Libertarian Walks Into a Bear, what you'll see is that lots of people came here and they really didn't have necessarily marketable skills and didn't know what they were going to do. They were living in tents and in trailers, and so a lot of them ended up in a town called Grafton, which isn't very big, and it was kind of a mess. And because so many of them moved to Grafton, they actually did have control over the Grafton town budget and how Grafton did a lot of things. They eliminated the fire department, for instance. You know, well, what happens then? Somebody's house catches on fire and there's nobody to put it out. They had to call, you know, other towns, and by the time the other towns got there, the house burns down. So yeah, they can get together and they can, if they get in a small enough place, and you know, I'd like to believe that New Hampshire isn't small enough for them to take over. But in a small enough place like Grafton, they can actually bring in their ideas and make the changes, you know, eliminate taxes and reduce services and all those kinds of things. But I think if you read this book, you'll see it really doesn't work out. And that's, you know, what I'm hoping that will eventually be the end result, and what the Free State Project will realize is that it doesn't work out for them either.
Right. And one of the things that I haven't had a chance to read the book, I have it, that Mike said was that even John Babiars, who was one of our big name libertarians in state, has been exiled by this group because he was sort of like, whoa, 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 whoa. You mean like no government, like no fire department? This is not good. This isn't safe.
Yeah, he thought some services at least were important.
Right. Well, that's where you get into the differences between limited government and no government, right? I think all of us believe in some form of government and what that looks like, and have, like, if we can operate off of that same base knowledge. But I think part of the hard part that is happening, you know, with some folks that have hit up with some of these folks that have moved here to our state that have run either on a local level or even some of the folks at the state level, is they're hitting up against a wall where it's sort of like you have an extreme ideologue that actually kind of doesn't really believe in government, or the form of government that we all of us as a base level know and understand, and can kind of bicker back and forth on these tiny little pieces.
Yeah. We create a government to provide a framework for how we live and how we work with each other. You know, it kind of goes back to that article from the New Hampshire Constitution that I read. And you know, there are things that we all need. We help people to help them improve their lives so that they can make a better contribution to society. And whether that's by providing them education or providing them health care or access to housing or something else. I mean, those are things that make everybody better, because it makes the people that you live with, your neighbors and your friends and the other people that live in your town, more successful. And that's what government does. Government isn't there to drain your pocketbook and you know, give money to fat cats. It's there to make things better for you and the people that you live with.
Right. I know. I enjoy having my roads plowed, quite frankly.
Yep.
I enjoy not hitting potholes in basic services like that. I enjoy having a transfer station to bring my garbage to, right?
And as it is, we don't spend enough money. I mean, I was talking about about transportation before. So in Wilton, we have 4 bridges actually that are on the red list. You know, and we're a fairly small town, so that's a lot of money for bridges. And the state has put the same amount of money into the red list since 1993. And yet the cost of fixing bridges has gone up dramatically since 1993. I mean, labor and materials and engineering and all those kinds of things have risen by orders of magnitude. And the state has, the solution to that was not to say, okay, we need to fix the bridges, we need to fix more bridges. Instead, the solution was, we'll just shut down the red list. So today, if a bridge is failing, you can't even get it on a list for the state to look at it. And if it's on the bottom of the red list right now, it might be 10 or 12 years before that gets fixed. So, transportation, being able to get from one side of a river to the other, that's one of the most important things for people who live in a town or a city. I mean, that's why bridges were among the first things built when people moved here as settlers. And yet, we don't seem to feel like as a state that it's important to spend enough money so it's safe, so that, a busload of kids on their way to school don't fall through the bridge and into the river.
Exactly. And I mean, it's one of those things too to also keep in mind, like how far some things have maybe even turned, like when people, I think, stop for a moment and think through the presentation of when some folks are maybe voting for Republicans, they're thinking of like a Yankee Republican, a traditional Republican, or even like, let's go back to an Eisenhower Republican, right? It's sort of, he did the Eisenhower interstate system. Like, where have we gone and where has the shift happened and why? So to kind of get at that sort of the here and now, like, hey, let's go back to 2020, just last year, and talk about some of these tactics that they've used to sort of move the needle to get to their end game and some of their goals here with the Libertarian Republicans here in state. And so what they had, they really created that coordinated state house agenda by those different organizations. Kermit kind of hit on it when he talked about the report cards that they have. So you have that model bill, you have the report card, and then what they do is they then flip that into knocking on doors or making phone calls or sending the mail pieces. It's more, right, frankly, from what I can see, it's more of the mail pieces that got sent out than the actual having conversations with community members about what was happening. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, the knocking on doors, they basically had the field to themselves because in 2020, as most of you remember, we actually had a pandemic. And so
We'll have a pandemic.
We still have a pandemic, yeah, but in 2020, I think that Democrats felt like going up to someone's house and knocking on their door and standing in the doorway and talking to them was not really very fair to those people, because if they didn't know you, they wouldn't necessarily know whether you were careful, whether you were coming in carrying COVID germs and could therefore transmit COVID to them. And so Democrats in general didn't do door knocking. Republicans and Libertarians and especially the Free State group really didn't care about any of that. And so they just went knocking on doors. And so they had the whole field to themselves. It made a big difference. It made a big difference.
Right, right. And so once again, to highlight sort of these groups that would focus more of what's happening at the state level, because remember, going back to Free Staters, their ideal of like, how are we going to create our Libertopia? It was specifically focusing at one chamber of a state legislature to really move their core beliefs. And how do you do that? And so all of these groups here, you have the Liberty Alliance, Republican Alliance, Josiah Bartlett, all of these different groups here. At one time, aside from the Liberty Alliance, they've always had the Free Staters. At one time, they would have, like I touched on before, some traditional Republicans from New Hampshire or Yankee Republicans, like a Judd Gregg or Charlie Bass or something like that, or one of those kinds of folks would have been on their board or yeah, on their board. But what you see now when you go and look at who makes up these organizations, who's on their board, you have folks that are these Free Staters that uprooted their entire lives and moved to our state with their extreme ideology. Or in the case of Americans for Prosperity, the person that's their state director is actually on the board for the Free State Project. And one of his first meetings that he had, he talked about, all right, what can I do to help get some national resources in here to help move your cause, move our shared cause.
And most of that money is from the Koch brothers.
Yep. Some of these national libertarian donors, not even libertarian Republicans. So these are the folks back in the 80s have been really funding and donating since then.
I think it'd be interesting to really think about whether there are any of those sort of old time Republicans still around. I mean, there obviously have to be voters who, you know, think more of a Judd Gregg than a Jason Osborne today. But they, you know, if they're still involved in politics, I think they must, you know, do the strange bedfellows approach, you know, that they see, you know, they're transactional. They see that by working together with these folks who they don't necessarily agree with, it gets them, you know, what they want. But I think, you know, I think back to somebody, you know, and this might date me a little bit, but somebody like Walter Peterson, you know, who was a Republican governor from Peterborough, and someone who really, you know, cared about not just the state, but about the people in the state. And I think, you know, I heard that his widow thought, you know, she wasn't really a Republican anymore, that, and Walter wouldn't have been if he was still around, that it's just moved so far away from what the Republicans of even the 60s were like in New Hampshire. And that's kind of sad. I mean, I've never wanted to be a Republican, but, you know, when Republicans were honorable and, you know, cared about some of the same things that I cared about, they were reasonable opponents. And now they seem more like snakes in the grass, something you have to be careful about.
Right. And I think another thing to talk about and touch on too is how starting in 2010, there was a real concerted effort to really, specifically at the State House, sort of within the Republican ranks, knock out those traditional folks. And so as time's gone on, where we used to, when I was in the House, and it was before Democrats had any majority, some of my closest friends and allies were actually Republicans, and the toxic sounds was such a small minority, a small caucus within the Republican caucus. And now it seems like that kind of extreme ideology or the ideologueness that kind of goes along with this libertarian Republican. Is that what the culture is like when you're at the State House, when you were at the State House most recently?
Yeah, I mean,
polarizing.
The thing was definitely polarizing. And like I was saying earlier, you know, the most common phrase I think I heard in speeches from Republicans on the House floor was taxation is theft. But the other thing that really strikes me about, especially how things went this year, and I am not there this year, so I can't say in detail how things work, but I look at what happened with the abortion bills, the changes to state abortion law, and libertarian perspective. You know, they believe in personal freedom, and they believe in you should be able to do things with your body or with your money or with your whatever the way you want to. But yet they were willing to vote for these really restrictive abortion laws because they got transactions. They got things that benefited them from the evangelical Republicans. And there's still a good chunk of evangelical Republicans out there. You know, neither one of them are Walter Peterson Republicans as far as I can see, but they each have kind of their own agenda and their own perspective. And to me, I would be embarrassed if I was a libertarian who voted to support such a restrictive abortion law, because to me, it walks right over the key tenets of being libertarian.
Right. you know, to kind of touch on that, let's sort of think about sort of how these folks that are currently in power got there. And it was by having a sizable amount of money flow into these races. So over $1.5 million was spent by a small group of national donors to flip our New Hampshire state legislature. Some of the groups focused on state Senate candidates, others focused on House candidates, and a couple of them kind of did a hybrid of both. But I don't know about you, but I can see how there was a transactional piece that occurred with placing this abortion bill within our state budget. This extreme policy was placed within our state budget, which is completely unheard of. It's non-germane. Let's talk about, like, hello. But maybe, you know, I'm connecting dots here. I don't know about you, but I'm assuming that the pro-life PAC, Protect Life PAC, Sanctity of Life PAC, Traditional Values PAC, Conservative Ideals PAC, we're looking for a return on investment for helping to elect these folks. I don't know about you, but those are some of my thoughts in looking at who donated to get this Libertarian Republican legislature elected into their small majority.
And for those of you who've never run for the state house like Caitlin and I have, you probably don't realize how little most candidates spend to run. I mean, it's, you know, we're going to get $100 a year, so it's not like we're going to spend $100,000 to get elected. Most people, they spend some money on yard signs. They might spend some money, you know, they might do a mailer. You know, $1,000 is probably a pretty significant amount of money to spend for the average candidate for the House. The Senate has to spend more because those districts are much larger. But if you're a House candidate, you're typically only trying to reach, you know, a few thousand voters. And so you don't need a whole lot of money to do that. But if somebody comes in and dumps a bunch of money in there, then they can do things like Facebook ads. You know, those were very effective in 2020 because people weren't going out. You know, you could have yard signs all over the place, but if people were staying inside their house, they didn't see them. You know, but they were on Facebook, and probably even more so on the internet in various places than ever before, because you're sitting home and you're bored and you got nothing to do. So the money, you know, $1.5 million doesn't seem like very much. And of course, Jason Sorens in his clip that you played was talking about 5 million, and that was, you know, 20 years ago.
Right.
I mean, the truth is, $5 million isn't very much money when there are 1 million voters in this state. And people who really care about having better policies than the ones that these folks would put in place ought to be willing to open their pockets and to put some money forward. Because, you know, if they have money, then other candidates have to have money to compete with them, you know. So we go from $500 on yard signs in a mailer to, you know, Facebook ads and newspaper ads, and maybe even, you know, hiring some staff people to be able to coordinate efforts and do door-to-doors and those kinds of things. I mean, it raises the cost for everybody to have, you know, this kind of money coming in. But if they're going to do it, we have to compete.
Right, right. And I think it's important to note too, with this $1.5 million, we're not talking, we have 400 reps, 24 state senators, but what they spent this on was on less than 70 candidates.
Oh,
so
yeah.
You break that down per person, per district, that is a lot of money being filtered into our communities for a specific cause from national entities, right? So it's no wonder that we're seeing some of what we're seeing coming out of Concord because of who donated to help elect these folks. And kind of maybe to touch on what you were talking about, how abortion rights kind of knocks up against the wall of libertarianism. I kind of see it as back to the point of how are they moving their agenda? They saw that as a compromise so that they can have buy-in next time around from these folks. They may not agree with it. They're like, all right, I'll give you that this time. Next time, you know, we'll see what happens, right? So, but I want to kind of dig in real quickly into what does this reality look like? I know Kermit's touched on it quite a bit as well, of what does this look like in our towns? What does it look like for our state? A lot of these bills that we've seen passed by the Libertarian Republican majorities in Concord are going to directly result in our local property taxes being raised, not this year, but next year, because that's the way the budgets are going to flow. We'll get a slight increase probably this year, probably be offset a little bit with all of this, the federal money coming in to help with our local communities. But it's there, it's going to be long term. Those impacts are there. Like Kermit said, those red listed bridges aren't going away. Hopefully we can get some of that Build Back Better money to help fix some of those bridges if right, if our elected officials allow that federal money to come into our state.
Yeah, right. If the executive council doesn't vote to not accept it.
Exactly. Do you want to talk a little bit about that $27 million that was denied?
Yeah, I think one of the things that a lot of people probably don't realize is that New Hampshire is really not doing very well as far as the pandemic is concerned. You know, a year ago, 6 months ago, you'd see Governor Sununu on TV every day talking about how, you know, how New Hampshire is way ahead of everybody else and our numbers are low. And then, you know, when the vaccine started to be available, you know, he was touting how New Hampshire was, you know, right on top of it. And the truth is, a lot of those numbers were wrong. And as news agencies have looked into it, they've found that actually what New Hampshire had reported back then and what New Hampshire reported more recently was actually not correct. And whether that was, you know, errors in the system or whether that was somebody lying, who knows? But the truth is, we're not doing that well. We're, you know, people are still dying. 35 people died in the last week from COVID. And we have way too many cases. We only have 55% of New Hampshire vaccinated, fully vaccinated. I mean, in my town, I live in a little town that's 3,700 people. And last week we had 34 new cases of COVID, which is way more than we had a year ago. So people are kind of losing control of, you know, the things that they did to keep themselves safe. So this idea of the federal government offering us money to have, you know, vaccine clinics and to maybe to make the vaccine more available to as they start to make it available to kids, which is, you know, really critical because a lot of those numbers in this state are coming out of the schools, not even just the kids, but also the teachers that associate with the kids. But that $27 million was really a small amount of money that would have had a big impact in terms of, you know, making portable, you know, van type clinics available in rural areas and, you know, making sure that there was enough people to be able to deliver those shots in people's arms. And we were the only state out of 50 states to turn that money down. You know, places that where there's probably even less vaccination than us, and there aren't that many states like that, but, you know, Mississippi or Alabama, they took the money. Now, maybe they just, you know, maybe it's transactional, and maybe they're going to try to spend it on something else, but, you know, turning that money down was just so short-sighted. And I think a lot of the reason they did it is because some of these libertarians went after them. You know, they marched into executive council meetings and you know, acted like they were going to take over. And, you know, if in a lot of other circumstances, if a bunch of Democrats had done it, we probably would have gotten arrested. But, you know, they let him speak, and then they kind of chased him out, and then they went ahead and did more or less what they asked him to.
Exactly. There's one of these free staters that ran for the state senate, and Sununu was there and helped do election work for that person. That person had the crowds all ginned up and literally called the governor to say, we're coming in and you shouldn't be doing this. And he picked up the phone. So for him to then say he's upset, yeah, he's taking phone calls. He's out there knocking or doing mail pieces, supporting and endorsing these folks that maybe don't necessarily agree with his values, but he sees them as folks that he needs to have in his corner for some reason. But then he also went and signed this budget with this radical policy in it. So he kind of talks out both sides of his mouth, but at the end of the day, he's supporting this agenda. All the state senators supported this agenda, and it's really creating a breakdown. And this is sort of how it looks, and this is how it plays out. It has real impacts. $27 million, that, like Kermit said, that means kids not having access to the vaccine during a time when cases are spiking in our schools. It's inhumane doing that.
Yeah, and I think the governor is very transactional, just like some of the other people we've talked about. You know, he has his eyes on doing something bigger, maybe running for Senate, maybe running for president, who knows? And if he sees getting the support from some of these out-of-state groups and some of these activist groups as part of his way to do that. And so he's going to support what they want, whether he really sees it, whether it's part of his philosophy or not.
Right. Well, that's
and then he'll downplay his choices.
Right. So I'm going to touch on real briefly here, sort of how these free staters feel about him, even after he helps elect them and supports them and has his face on mailers with them. Earlier this year, I guess it was recorded that he said that Libertarians are taking over the Republican Party, and the free staters saying, yeah, we are. What are you going to do about it? They're calling him out. Like, what are you going to do? And then another one here is a tweet I got from one of these folks saying that didn't agree with what I had to say, saying if I don't agree with his way of thinking, then I can just uproot my entire life and move to a different state. And I'm sorry, I'm just not going to uproot my life. And I'm more than certain there's probably over 1.3 other million people that legitimately can't just uproot their lives because we don't agree with your extreme political ideology. It's just, I'm not sure what world they're living in, but it's different from the actual reality of what everyday New Hampshire citizens are facing and what their worlds look like. And so real quickly, I'm going to share another audio clip here, or video clip actually, to kind of tie it all back to the original sound clip. Another sound clip here.
I'm thinking about creating a new service. So we have the Free State Project, which is, all the Free State Project is telling libertarians, stop beating your head against the wall. Most of the people you talk to will never turn libertarian. You will never have a libertarian society. Instead, pick up and move over here and help us build a libertarian society with a whole bunch of libertarians who share that basic ethic that they will not use violence against you. Okay, so that's all the messages for Free State Project. But I think that we needed something else called the Slave State Project, which says, all you New Hampshire people who are here who can't stand these changes, this slide into liberty that's going on, this freeing up of human beings. Well, you pick whichever state you want that is going in the right authoritarian direction. You know, you don't like guns. Well, here's all the states that outlaw guns all together. You know, and we will find a libertarian in that state, and we're going to do a wife swap. Okay, so we'll swap you guys. We'll pay for. We'll help you pack. We'll help you load up the truck. You can actually stay in the libertarian's house while he sells it. While we sell it for him, and he can stay in your house while we sell it for you. But you can have exactly the government. You have 49 choices, authoritarian choices out there. And you can pick and choose whichever one you want. We'll help you go there, and we'll bring someone here who actually wants liberty. You know, so it's I call it state swap, or the slave state project. But we need something else for all these people, because they're going, well, look, you know, I'm living here. I really wanted to turn this.
All right, so to bring it back to some of the original words of the person that created this movement, where a very small amount of people have actually taken them up on it, but they have done so, and a few of them have been elected to our legislature. Like, this is where they're coming from. So we have an elected officials that moved here as part of this movement that is really being endorsed by the Republican establishment here. And they're of the thought and belief that if we don't agree with who they are and what they're about, then we can just leave.
Yeah, the idea that basically 20,000 people, if they ever get to that number, you know, should convince, you know, 1 million other people that they don't belong here. You know, I think it's crazy, and I think we're making the mistake, you know, because if we let them do this, you know, that's the only way it's going to happen, is if we let them do this. If we sit back and say, well, you know, we don't need to get involved. This isn't, you know, something. This isn't my fight. If you take that attitude, then they could succeed, you know, but there's really only a handful of them. And so we only lose if we sit on the sidelines.
Exactly. I agree. And so real quick, I'm going to recap here that before I move into what we can do to take some action here, is the Libertarian Republicans here in the state and the Free State Project members have extreme goals for our state. And these Libertarian Republicans and Free State Project members have plans and tactics for achieving their goals. And these extreme goals, plans, and tactics are dividing our communities, and they're dividing our communities on purpose. So how do we stop this attack on our democracy? I think an important thing that we need to remember, and I just pulled a quick quote from Senator Paul Wellstone that I thought was nice. It talks about how politics is not about money or power games or winning for the sake of winning. Politics is about the improvement of people's lives, lessening human suffering, advancing the cause of peace and justice in our country and the world. Just like here in New Hampshire, as part of the Constitution, as Kermit said, and we have our selectmen and overseer of the poor, it's like we have an inherent nature about us from when we started about how we want community and how government is okay if it's making lives better. And I think one of the things that we need to also remember is the public supports us for a lot of our ideas. We're not the ones that, in order to move whatever sort of vision we have to do it by extreme measures of dropping $1.5 million to elect a handful of people, or attaching extreme policy to state budget. That's what these folks have to do to move their agenda. So we have a winning message. The public already supports us and what we believe in. And so it's the Libertarian Republicans, they're the ones that are moving the extreme measures in any way possible that involves minimal communication with actual people, minimal interaction with those folks in their communities. And do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so what's funny out there is I just took a look at Twitter, and our some of our viewers, Keith Ammon, I see you out there. Keith and I were in the legislature together. They are tweeting about what we're doing. So it looks like they're maybe a little worried about us. Maybe worried that we actually have a point to make. And I think hopefully this audience, those of you who aren't free staters or libertarians who are here just to try to make fun of us, will recognize that there is a point to be made and that this is really important. You know, if you don't want to pick up and move out of state and trade with a free stater, if you believe that New Hampshire is the place that you want to live your life, if you love New Hampshire, like I think most of us who live here do, then you're going to want to not just sit back and say, well, you know, it's just a political fight and I'm not, you know, going to step in on one side or the other. You need to take a stand. And I don't think what these guys want to do is going to benefit you. So take some time, look into it, but you really need to understand what's going on. And that's the whole reason for having this presentation. It isn't to make fun of the free staters. It isn't to, you know, to make them, you know, somehow look like the boogeyman, even if they are the boogeyman. But it's to make sure that you recognize what's going on and have an opportunity to do something about it because it's your state too.
Right, right. And so ways that folks can take action is really simple. Vote, 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 vote. Vote in your town elections, vote in your city elections, vote in special elections, attend meetings, get involved, vote in our state elections. Research who the candidates are, not just the Republicans or the people running as Republicans are really libertarians. Research all of the candidates, be an informed voter. Who is Kermit? Why does he want to be my state rep? What's he about? Pick up the phone and call these folks and ask them the hard questions because New Hampshire is such a small place. Our communities are so small. I know I have really great communication with several of my local officials just to one, get to know who they are, but two, so they know who I am and what I stand for and what I believe in so that we can have a dialogue and we can have communication and we can have disagreements without them saying, you don't agree with me, you need to move away. No. So communication, one-to-one, make it relational. Let's bring it back to neighbors. Ways that you can also take action to inform folks is writing letters to the editor or you yourself stepping up to run for office. There are so many different things that you can do to take action, whether with what you've learned tonight or what you want to do, who you are, and what you're about. And then I guess we can do some Q&A. I can do a stop share.
So there's lots of questions out there. I see at least 20 of them. And some of them are pretty simple. One of them, for instance, is, did the Free State Republicans vote for the budget with the abortion restrictions? And they absolutely did. You know, at least on the House side, it's a very close contest between Republicans and Democrats. There's, I believe the number is maybe 20 votes difference between Republicans and Democrats. And so if everybody didn't vote, then if every Republican didn't vote on the Republican side, if a few of them, just a few of them voted with the Democrats, things wouldn't pass. That's why we're still not a right to work state, because there were a few Republicans who were willing to vote against right to work. another question I see on here is about Bill Weld, who ran on the Libertarian ticket as vice president. Is he severe? Well, I think Bill Weld is kind of transactional. I think he was looking for an opportunity to keep in the public eye, since he left the Massachusetts State House, where he certainly was not a libertarian. He had lost his audience. So, running as vice president on the Libertarian ticket was a chance to try to be a little bit more visible. Any questions you want to take up off that list?
Sure. I see someone asked about agitators going in from outside communities to school board meetings. I have seen some of that where you have, there's someone here, even in my town, that will go to other towns in their school board meetings and hold signs. So there is some of that happening. And that's not something that we're just seeing here in New Hampshire, unfortunately. That is something that you're seeing across the country, with part of this ginning up of feelings of distrust and just that's being sowed for the 2022 election.
So I see somebody asking about abortion bills, and apparently maybe my voice didn't come through. And so basically what I was saying was that the abortion restrictions that were put in, as Caitlin mentioned, they didn't pass them as individual bills, they put them in the state budget. And I don't know if any of you have ever read the state budget. I certainly have. And there's actually two bills in the state budget. One is the actual numbers, and the other is what's called the trailer bill, which has all the sort of application rules for how that money is going to be applied. And it is massive, thousands of pages. And so a lot of people don't really even look at the details. They just vote. They do, if your leadership says you should vote for it, you vote for it. So those bills or those restrictions were put in the budget as a way to hide them. But in reality, if you're a libertarian and you really believe that people's individual freedom is the most important thing, you shouldn't be voting for something that puts those kind of restrictions in place. And if enough of those, if all the people who have those free state affiliations had voted against the budget, they would have had to take the budget and take those things out of it and put it back up again. But they didn't, because like I said, I think it's transactional. I think they think they're going to get support from the evangelicals for things that they want, and in exchange, they're supporting the things the evangelicals want. And the truth is that neither of those two collections of ideas or changes to state law really benefit the majority. In most surveys I've seen, 70% of people in New Hampshire are not in favor of those types of abortion restrictions.
So someone asked how many folks have moved here. I think it's really hard to tell. Somewhere just recently, they said somewhere around 2,000 members have actually moved here, but it's hard to tell over 20 years or so, or a little less than 20 years, like, have people moved? Have they not moved? And so I think the thing is the perception of the reality of these free staters and their impact is a lot stronger than their actual reality of what they've actually been able to accomplish. And so if I was, like, I'll say this again, if I was a Republican, I'd be seriously thinking through, are these folks actually threats, or do I just need to do what I need to do to actually go back to governing the way we used to?
So I see a question that says, what happens when a community runs into a situation like Merrimack did with PFAS? Who monitors, who remedies, who regulates? The truth is, in the libertarian paradise, sort of the end state of a libertarian takeover of New Hampshire, those things would probably be way down the list, because you wouldn't have a police force, and you wouldn't have, as I mentioned before, they eliminated the fire department in Grafton, even though it was a volunteer fire department, they didn't want to put up the money for the equipment. And you would end up having to pay for your own services because no taxes would be raised for services. So as far as anybody regulating the things that might kill you down the road, like PFAS, that's like way off in space. I mean, in a libertarian world, you don't do that because, of course, you want to let any business that wants to do whatever they want to do it, because after all, it's their freedom. But the reality is, what they do has an impact on you. And it may not be immediately visible, which is why things like PFAS, those chemicals were put into the air and the water and the soil many years before people really realized that it was a problem.
All right, well, we're just at past 8:30. I'm not sure. I want to be mindful and respectful of everyone's time.
I think that might be my cue to come in and thank our speakers, our panelists. I learned a lot this evening. Thank you very much, both of you, Caitlin and Kermit. And I also want to mention are the two names that appear below, Bev Cotton and Katie Cutchell, both are county executive committee members who did an outstanding job of organizing tonight's event. As I mentioned earlier, this is will be appearing on YouTube, so please share it with your friends. That's the whole purpose of this, is to get the word out to the voters. A lot of people are not aware of what's happening in their own state. I know I was born here. I've lived here. In fact, I've lived in Hillsborough County now for over 71 years, and I don't intend to move because somebody with different ideas comes into my state. Sorry, but ain't happening. Please join us again next week, same time, same station, when we present the elephant in the womb, the Republican attack on reproductive freedom, with special guests, Congresswoman Annie Custer, Executive Councilor Cindy Warmington, and State Senator Tom Sherman. Our host that evening will be Representative Kat McGee from Hollis. I thank you again, everybody, for tonight. And I think that's going to be it for tonight. Thank you all, and good night.